So what you have before you today, Sarah is an utmost professional in underwriting these projects, turning the very complex into something very simple. Mixed use projects. So if it is a commercial project where a part of it is housing and a part of it is commercial, Sarah is doing it all. Also, we want to welcome a few PIDC clients who have experienced working with PIDC and Sarah in these projects. So again, we have online with us today great PIDC clients who, as Sarah is going through the presentation, will give you their experience. And every experience isn't good. So they're going to speak to what worked, what didn't work. If they had to do it all over again, what would they change? So we welcome Fireball Printing, a great PIDC client. We welcome True Hand Society, another great PIDC client, and Eatable Delights. All of them, again, have gone through this process of buying and financing commercial real estate. So with that, Sarah, take it away.
Great. Hi, everybody. And sorry, I'm experiencing some technical difficulties today. So I'm coming to you from my phone. So hopefully this will go well. But thankfully I've given this presentation before. So hopefully I know what I'm doing just on my phone. I'm excited to welcome, as Marla said, our clients, Paul and Catherine. I know we didn't have a chance to chat beforehand. So please just feel free to either kind of raise your hand or just unmute yourself and chime in. I know it's more difficult when we're not in person, but I will also pause at certain times to make sure that you have time to ask questions, and I have a few for you as well. Okay, and thanks, Quinn. Yeah. Do we need to do a reminder of how to interact?
We can.
Did everyone hear it? I didn't know because since I was late.
Yeah, Marla went through it already. I think we're okay to go to the agenda.
Okay, great. All right, we can start then. I think I have an agenda slide to begin.
Okay. 1 second, let me transition.
Okay, awesome. So the first is going to be talking about project management of whatever you're buying and financing and how that affects your lender and kind of just the overview of planning it out. And I'm going to kind of go through like a full, here's all of the things that need to happen in order to close on your property and to finance your property. And some of this will be a little bit of overlap of what folks heard yesterday on the due diligence items that Dorothy talked about, but we'll actually even pile more on today because we're going to be talking about construction, if there's construction in your project. So we'll be adding another layer. And then hopefully folks got the email last week. I think Marla sent it out on Thursday, but I have kind of sent around a template, an Excel template for budget and operating pro forma. And so we're gonna walk through that together, and that's gonna be a resource that you can kind of take home with you. And then the last part will be talking about the PIDC financing resources that you could utilize, as well as other resources. We know we're not the only people, out there, and we also, don't do exclusively housing projects. So we want to make sure if that's something that you're considering, that our partners out there that are doing, that are financing those projects. Okay, so let's go to the first slide. All right, great. So the first thing is to really step back and decide what is your plan that you want to do, right? And the plan can be simple or complex. So at the simplest, and even then it's not simple because Dorothy went through a bunch of things that you still have to do. But the simplest would be that you're an owner-occupied business and you want to purchase a property, and you don't need to do any work on it. We call that as is. And you would just move in, right? So you purchase, you still have to go through the due diligence that Dorothy was talking about to purchase the property. But after you do that, you move right in and you probably get a mortgage loan for the property. And it's based on how well your business is doing, right? And what kind of resources you have personally. All right, so that's kind of the simplest end. Then you get more complicated. For instance, what if you need to do renovation, but you still want your business to move in? That's a little bit more complicated. And then you add another layer in. What if you're doing renovation and you're going to bring in tenants? Okay, well then you're getting more complicated. You need more time probably to put it together. So today we're going to talk about the most complex because I want you to be prepared for that. And then you can always scale it down depending on your experience level and your financial level. So let's move to kind of the like massive slide, Quinn, that's like the overview of everything you have to do. Hopefully everyone has big enough screens to see all this, but I'm going to walk through. And again, a lot of this is going to be what Dorothy touched on yesterday and just adding. So moving back, I think I like to think of purchasing and financing a property as you kind of have to be like a conductor of sorts, right? You have to keep a bunch of different things moving. And if one backs up, you kind of have to back them all up, right? So when you're defining your plan, you have to think about the long-term revenue and operating of that plan. So for instance, if you are going to renovate a property that you're purchasing and you need to take out a loan, you need to think, well, how am I going to pay that loan? If if the loan is more than what you're doing now, for instance, it's more than your rent, then you need to think, well, is my business growing for some reason? And how do I know that it's growing? Or am I going to get tenants in and they're going to pay rent? And that's enough to pay the loan, right? But then you have all these other expenses. So you have to really, what's going to happen in the future is really kind of dictates what you're able to do in the current state. And then in addition to that, you have all of these, right? So once you kind of decide on that plan, you have all of these elements that you have to manage. So you have we're going to go through today, your team. Who is your team that you're going to do? So yesterday, Dorothy talked about hiring, a lawyer and some other folks. So we're going to go through, do you need those people? What would they do? When do you engage them? You've defined your project. So we talked about that. And then, you have to find your location. Dorothy talked about a number of places where you can find some properties for sale. And then we're going to get into, again, today, how do you kind of approach the construction part? And I know, again, our clients at Fireball Printing have some unique experience, or not unique, I should say, because a lot of people go through it, but they have some great experience to share with you about the construction process. Budgeting, we're going to go through today, especially with that Excel sheet. And then again, the long-term operations of the property. This is all stuff that has to be done at the same time. So that's really the challenge. And I know a lot of folks were asking yesterday, like, how long do I need to do all of this? And it really depends on the complexity. And the thing is that you could acquire a property and do construction later. That's certainly possible and could even be helpful, but you want to at least have that construction in mind when you're purchasing, because you want to know what your budget is. What if you purchase a property and you haven't done any of that construction due diligence? Then you might be purchasing it and you can't occupy it, right? And that would be pretty terrible. So you need to at least do parts of these in order to purchase your property. Okay, so let's start with the team. So some of the classic partners are you would have an architect, right? And maybe if it's serious enough in terms of the renovation, you might need an engineer. We talked yesterday about Dorothy as a real estate attorney. If you're doing leases, you might need someone who specializes in leasing, and so there are different attorneys. You might want to think about partners. Do you need to bring in an equity partner? Like if you don't have enough cash to put a deposit down, you might need to bring in someone who can bring equity. And we see a lot of people do that. And you could go to friends and family, you could go to colleagues. Or you could just go to other people that you don't know in Philadelphia. We see this happen all the time. People partner up. They met each other one time at a networking, event or a real estate event, and then they're, doing a project together because they have a similar vision. So that's certainly possible. And so that team is really the one, like at the very beginning, you would have those engagements with people, right? So if you have an architect, A&E means architect and engineering. There's a lot of lingo, and I'll kind of try to go through it today. You would engage them, and then they would start working on the drawings. Later on in the process, if you brought in partners, you would start to look at crafting organizational documents. Who owns what of this entity? How do we distribute? How do we put in capital? How do we distribute profits? Those are things that, again, you would definitely need a lawyer to help you with. And at the very, end of this end stage, you would need to get in your equity contribution from your partners. And also what's not written here, I guess I have it on the next line, is if you had tenants that were, obviously residential tenants come in later, but if you're going to have a commercial tenant, you really want to know that more up front. You want to be talking to those folks, at the very beginning of the process, and then you would sign leases with them. Okay, so we talked a little about defining the project. Here you would say, again, are you renovating? Are you getting tenants? If you're getting tenants, what are the market comps? What is that space going for? So you need to do some homework in that area. And again, at the very end of this process, you would need to get signed leases, or if you're a business and you think you're expanding, we would need to see those signed contracts to show that you have new business coming in. Okay, so let's go to the location. So Dorothy talked about this yesterday. You would need to do some environmental reports. We recommend everyone do a phase 1. For those of you who aren't sure what that is, it's really just kind of like a paper trail report of that property. So and in Philadelphia, these properties have been around for a long time. So an environmental phase 1 would just tell you, this property has been blank over the past, 150 years. It would tell you what it was used for. It would go through all the records that exist. If there were ever any environmental records on it, it would let you know. So it's really just it's just paper. It's really just looking back at the records. So sometimes here we find out that something used to be a laundromat. That's usually not good for environmental. That has some of the worst environmental damage. But maybe, it's really interesting in Philadelphia. We see properties all the time that look like they're single family homes, but in the past they served as commercial businesses. Because if you think about it, a lot of people have, had a business and then lived above it. That was really, really typical. So you might have something that was served as a printing office and then people lived above it. So that's pretty typical. We got a question about where do you find these reports? So you would actually hire someone to do this. So this is, again, another member of your team. An environmental consultant is something that you can find. Your lawyer could recommend that. Your architect is probably the best person to recommend somebody for the environmental report. They're not necessarily super expensive, especially just the phase 1, but they're worth it. They're definitely worth that investigation. So you would, again, hire an environmental consultant.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah.
We have a question from Anika. She asked, where can you find these reports?
Oh, that's what I was just answering. So that's what I was saying. You would hire an environmental consultant for a phase 1. And then if it comes back that it's likely that there's environmental contamination, again, we just from the records, like, was it a laundromat, something that would indicate that there's likely to be environmental contamination, then you would move to a phase 2, which is where they actually go in and start testing your particular property. So those are two kind of different types of reports. I'm not exactly sure how much things environmental consultants cost. I'm gonna phone a friend here. Lawrence, do you have, I have a little bit of a sense, but I'm not positive. And I think it depends on the complexity. I'm gonna say a couple $1,000s.
Yes. All right. Well, yeah, it really depends on the size of the property and actually the use of the property. So the consultant from residential could be, like you said, from several $100s to a few $1,000s for the initial phase 1 test. But it gets more expensive as you do the additional tests recommended by phase 1.
Right. And some people get to stop at the phase 1. Those lucky people, they get to stop at the phase 1. Okay. And again, we have we have a client said phase 1 reports have done for 1,500 to 3,500 for some industrial buildings up to 30,000 square feet. And then, yeah, the phase 2, which is actually testing your property, they said it's gone to 20,000. Thank you so much. So phase 2 can really be expensive. I do see that some people, industrial properties, you might kind of just assume that you're going to have to do that. But I have seen some people, just stop if they get a phase 1 that comes back kind of, negative. They just stop the process and they look for a different property. So that's something to know when to walk away, and get those before you kind of get too far into it.
Sarah,
Dorothy, yeah.
There are certain types of, for even the small small properties in retail areas that send a red flag. Certain uses send a red flag to environmental consultants. And number one is any type of company that may be using chemicals, such as dry cleaners or gas stations.
Yes, absolutely. And especially for gas stations, sometimes it could be just a gas station was nearby. Or the dry cleaner, even if it was next door, that can sometimes be an issue. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so another question came in about, can buyers, can they negotiate with sellers if the environmental issues come back high? And that's absolutely the case. I mean, it obviously depends on the market, but if you get an environmental report that comes back that there are issues, then you could talk to your seller about that. The thing is that sometimes the phase 1, and I'd be interested in our clients' feedback on this. The phase 1 doesn't necessarily tell you, because again, it's just saying what could be an issue. It's not actually testing your property. The phase 1 doesn't often have prices in it in terms of fixing the problem. So that's why sometimes you need to move on to a phase 2 to get pricing on that. And you would want to have a large contingency with your seller if you are going to stick with that property. So that's a big one. That's like one of the first questions that Lawrence and I asked that your lender is going to be interested in is, have you done environmental reports? And we actually read them, through to see what the risks are. Anybody else on the phone have experience with environmental reports that they want to share?
If you have a mic, I'm happy to unmute you.
Okay, well, there'll be time for more questions at the end, so we'll kind of continue on. Dorothy talked about getting your zoning or your use permit early on in the stage as well. So if you want to do something with your property that it's not zoned for, you might need to go through a zoning process, which could take several months depending on what you want to do for it, right? And then I think she also mentioned that something that would happen is an appraisal to determine the value of the building. I recommend waiting until you get your lender on board, typically your bank is going to want to order the appraisal themselves. So there's really no need for you to order the appraisal. The bank probably wouldn't utilize it. There's pretty strict rules about appraisals, and banks have to go through kind of a blind process to get the fair market value in an appraisal. Okay, there was another question about how hard is it to change zoning use? Well, it definitely depends on what the change is. I'm not an expert in Philadelphia's, zoning. I would say that what we do is we have a contact at the city planning and development office. There is a group there headed up by a person named John Monlack, and we can provide his contact to you, who kind of is supposed to be like a one-stop shop for helping people through the real estate process, permitting process with the city. And so our PIDC often recommends him or goes to him to say, what does this property need? And so he can kind of help you through like exactly what the zoning or permitting process would be for a particular property.
Sarah, if I can
Yep.
interject as well?
Yep.
So the zoning could be sometimes an issue if you're trying to change a use that the community does not want. So to get a zoning variance approved, a lot of times you need the support of a registered community organization. So it's good to know what the plans are that the community has planned for their community, and that their plans sort of correlate to your plans for the use of the property.
Yeah, that's right. That's a big part of the process. Yeah, you would absolutely want to know that. Another question came in, do you want to know that before purchase? And yes, because if you, again, this is kind of part of that plan. So if you purchase a building with a plan in mind, right? So you purchase, a single family home, but you want to have a business out of it. And for some reason, that's not part of the zoning code for that neighborhood. And you need to get, zoning, or you want to put a parking lot in, and you need a zoning permit for that for some reason. Again, if that is critical to your plan, and then it's not possible from a zoning perspective, or you get denied at zoning, then you might have just purchased a property that doesn't work for you. So it's really critical to look at the zoning before purchase. The environmental phase 1, the zoning and use permit, that would all be before purchase. Really, all of these things would ideally, anything we're talking about today would ideally be before purchase. And another question to follow up on that was, should you survey in different neighborhoods first before choosing a location? Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by survey, but you definitely want to make sure whatever you're doing does fit in line with that community's plan. So there's a couple ways of going about this. The city of Philadelphia has what's known as the 2035. Yeah, okay. It's the 2035 plan. And that's for each neighborhood. It's really not neighborhood. It's kind of section of the city. And there's a plan for each section. And so you might want to kind of look at those plans to make sure that whatever you're proposing, especially if it's different from what's there now, fits in with that community plan. And then as Lawrence mentioned, you might want to find the registered community organization and the registered community organization can be found on the City of Philadelphia website. Again, we could provide links, but there's a couple things here. So if you kind of search on the City of Philadelphia's website for registered community organization, they have a map of them. So that could help you kind of find those organizations and reach out to them as well to have a conversation. So perfect example, I had a client reach out to me about a month ago, they had actually already purchased a property, but they were open to what they did with it. They didn't have a specific plan. They had a tenant approach them, and they came to PIDC to finance the construction work for that tenant. And, you know, it was a type of use that I wasn't sure what the community would want. And so I reached out to the community organization, and we had a call with all three parties, me, the community organization, and the client, who was the owner of the property. And they talked it through and kind of came to resolution that that tenant would not be a good fit for the community. And so that client ended up moving on and is looking for a different tenant. So that's like something that, you know, we encourage those upfront communications, you know, ahead of time, so that you don't get into, again, a scenario where you were really planning on something and it's not possible. Okay, so there was another kind of comment question that says, you could go ahead and make your purchase with a zoning contingency as well. That would allow the buyer to continue with due diligence pending zoning. You can absolutely continue, but what I'm saying is you probably don't want to purchase it before you get that zoning approval. So you could absolutely continue the due diligence, but if you purchase it, there's no more contingency, right? You can't give it back. So that's something you would work through while you're doing other things. And that's a perfect example of like kind of this chart, is that as you're working on zoning, it's not just something that you're going to pop in and be like, okay, I accomplished zoning, I'm going to move on to something else. That's a process that you kind of have to follow for several months while you're doing all of these other things, right? So that's a good kind of point there. Okay, I'll pause. Any other questions? I know there's a lot on location that has to be done, and this is really just a high level overview. Okay, so let's move on to construction, because that's another one. Again, you would want to, with a lot of people through their architect recommends a general contractor. You could also, you know, you would ask around about a general contractor. And the thing is that when you first begin, you would kind of want to do a conceptual design. That's what we call it, conceptual design of the renovation that you want to make. So it's always helpful to have your architect do a design, and then you would have the construction contractor price it out. And what happens is the conceptual design is really just kind of, it's a high level design. It doesn't get into the nitty gritty details. And so at that point, you want to put a large contingency into your construction budget, because you haven't gotten into those details yet. And then as you move along on this gray line that I have here, you would do more design further into the detail. And every time you do one of those new designs, you would go back to your contractor and have them price it out again. So this is a good way to kind of keep your budget up to date as you move along, you know, in this process, because the designs get further and further detailed with things like the plumbing and the electrical and the code. You don't realize that sometimes you put a plan on paper, but then when you actually go to measure it, oh, you don't have, you know, handicap accessible spacing. So everything needs to be redesigned. And now you have to like build a new bathroom. And it's an extra, you know, 30 grand. So that could be like really big elements that aren't known until you get into like the details of the code and some of the mechanicals. Okay, so, oh yeah, so there's a comment here about another comment about zoning, which is really interesting. So someone purchased a commercial property that had a particular use that was in operation for 20 years, a particular use, but apparently that was actually an illegal use in that zoning. So once you change owners to open that same business, you would actually have to go through a zoning process. So that's a really great point to make, that you want to check zoning even if you're proposing the same thing, because just kind of having new ownership might mean that you are on the hook for something that the original owner wasn't. So that's just a really great point. That's the same type of thing that happens if you're doing renovation and you, with the code, with the building code, right? So if you're doing a certain amount of renovation, the whole property might have to follow the current building code. So stuff, for instance, if like a bathroom was in operations previously that didn't meet, you know, the ADA rules, but you go ahead and do, you know, renovate some other part of the building, you might have to, depending on, you know, what the scope of your budget is and what Philadelphia's the building code says, you might actually have to go and make your bathroom ADA compliant, even though the other owner was able to operate it, you know, fine. Yeah, and so the other thing to talk about is that your contractor should also ideally have experience with whatever financing route you're going down. So that's another important thing to note. So if you just, you know, if you're using a bank, hopefully the contractor has done projects where the bank would be involved. And why is that important? Because things need to be by the book when you have, you know, a bank involved with construction. So we're going to ask to see all of those pricing that the contractor did, but we're also going to ask for construction documents on official forms, right? We're going to want, you know, again, we're going to want those contractors. They're going to have to, you know, put their everything on and what's called an AIA form each month to get reimbursed for their work. So those are all things that your contractor, you know, should have really good bookkeeping if you're going to go down like the banking route for your construction. Now, a lot of people finance construction with cash, but if you're going to finance construction with a bank or with PIDC, that's something to keep in mind. Lawrence, my colleague, also brought up that for some of you, you probably have heard of the state grant RACB, and that you would absolutely want your contractor to have experience with that program, because that requires prevailing wages, which are kind of the prevailing wage of the city of Philadelphia. Actually, it's the prevailing wage of the state of Pennsylvania. And it also requires that they certify payrolls with the city. And so there's a process there, and it can be, again, it's not difficult. It's difficult in terms of the paperwork that's required, the administrative work. So if you're going through one of those programs, you would absolutely want to make sure your contractor is somebody who has experience with that kind of bookkeeping. So that's an important thing to know. And then, you know, real briefly, before we get into the Excel sheet, I'll touch on the budget and the operation, because this is really where you kind of have to back everything up, right? So the budget is, you're going to keep refining the budget with your contractor, but that's not the only thing that costs money, right? So this environmental report, that costs money. The zoning, a lawyer, that costs money. Those things are all going to be in your budget. So that's something that you want to kind of keep track of, and you don't want to forget about those. Those things are, we call soft costs, right? So your architect, your lawyer, your environmental reports, any of your permits, they cost money. Taxes that you're going to pay while you're holding the property. Utilities that have to be turned on while you are kind of working on the property. You might have to pay like a percentage of your or more of your loan, right? So you want to put in financing costs. You might have to pay the lawyer fees for the bank. Those are all things that you want to include in your budget. And again, I have a draft budget that we can go through. And then at this time, while you're doing everything else, you want to be approaching your lenders, wherever you're going to get your money, PIDC or bank or both. You want to approach them for term sheets, right? And then as you're moving all of these other elements, things get more and more serious with the bank, right? So they care about PIDC, we care about all of these elements. So we, as again, the term sheet, we might want to see the environmental report. We might want to see the market comps first. We might want to know that you have an architect engaged and that a contractor has priced out the work. We would want to see all that stuff, and then we want to see you get more and more detailed and serious as you go through, and then we'll kind of, then we get more detailed and more serious, and it goes from term sheet to commitment letter, and then the final would be closing on a loan. I think I saw. Did I see another question? Oh, maybe not. Okay.
I did not see a question. You're good.
Okay, sorry. And then, and the other thing to note here on the budget is if something has changed, for instance, if you were, I gave the example of like, you might need to redo a bathroom that you weren't considering. Okay, so that would change your budget. Well, then how are you going to pay for that? That's a main question. Are you able to get more of a loan? Are you able to put in more cash? Those are things that really you need to determine if the budget goes up. So that's always something important. And then again, finally, you want to look at long-term operations. And this goes back to the fact that you might have a loan that has to be paid back over a number of years, and you want to make sure that you have money coming in every year to pay that loan off. So that's something that you have to look at, upfront. If you are doing a project and it's getting too expensive, you might need to think, how else can I create value here? Do I need to bring in another tenant? So something really, something that's happened a lot with our business clients is that they have wanted to purchase a property for their business. They look for a property. They might even want to grow in the future. Okay, but at the moment, they can't afford the entire building. So we've had quite a number of tenants now who have purchased a property and then they've leased it out to other businesses for maybe 5 years so that they give themselves time to grow. The other thing that does is it brings in revenue for you to pay a loan that enabled the renovation to happen. So that by the time that tenant has 5 years and then they move on, you have a renovated space for your business to kind of expand into. So that's a great way, and it's been paid for because you had this tenant paying rent all those years. So that's a really great model that we've seen work for a number of clients. That can also be done with residential on top. So we also have had clients who've moved into storefront spaces and then they rent a couple apartments above. Again, that brings in other revenue so that you're not just relying on the business to pay that loan. That's something that as lenders, Lawrence and I love to see, is that you have multiple different sources of revenue, not just your company. And so that can really increase the amount of loan that you're able to get. Okay, I'm gonna pause. Are there any more questions on this before we move into the Excel template? Yeah, and it's, I did have a couple other, I did have a couple other questions. So before we move on, so I had, what is the value of having an inspection of an existing property? Okay, so an inspection, well, so obviously, if you are just doing a property as is, you would still want to get an inspection, right? Because you want to see, oh gosh, and this is important even if you're just buying a home, how stuff you can't see. How is the roof? Is there mold? Things that to the common eye we wouldn't notice. They might notice something in the plumbing that just doesn't look right. So that's absolutely critical to have an inspection before you purchase a property, no matter what you're going to do with it. even if it's just a home. And obviously folks have probably had that experience of purchasing a home where you get an inspection and it comes back with something that tells you, oh, this is going to cost more money. I need that knocked off the sale price. So that's obviously an important part in negotiating the sale price. If you're going to do construction or renovation on a property, I recommend more than just an inspection. An inspection is just like what is. If you're going to do renovation or construction, you really want to bring in a contractor to walk that space. They might need to walk it several times. I'm working with someone right now. They're in their due diligence period. They put in an offer. Before they put in an offer, they had a contractor go out to see it. After they put in an offer, they're having, during their due diligence, they're having a contractor go out multiple times. The architect goes out to see it, and they really start drawing up those plans. So you might go in that property several times before actually purchasing it. Okay, so then there was a comment about contingency line item. Again, contingency is a big part of the budget, and the contingency actually needs to be larger the earlier you are in your project. Because as I mentioned, those plans don't get detailed enough yet, and you don't know when they're going to happen. So at the very beginning, you might want a 15%, even 20% contingency on what you're working on. And then as you do the next estimate, and as time goes on and you get closer to the construction happening, those costs might actually go up, but then you can reduce your contingency. But even at the end, we'd like to see the contingency to be at least 7 to 10%. We usually say 10% for renovation and 7% for new construction is usually what the bank might like to see. All right. Any last call for questions on this slide before we move into templates? Okay, great. We are, Quinn, are you able to bring up the Excel sheet?
Sure can. And just a friendly reminder to the attendees as we're making the switch, if you posted a question, but it gets lost in the chat box, send it over to the Q&A. It aggregates it all for us and we have a better chance of identifying it. Yeah. 1 second here. It looks like here we go. Can you see it?
Great. Yeah. Awesome. All right, guys. Well, I'm hoping that this is a tool for everyone. Please, if you don't use this type of form and you have your own, that's totally fine. This is just like a sense of what I want to see as a lender. You can use any format at all. So, don't worry about this specific type of template. It's just supposed to be helpful for you. So something I want to see, right, is the what we call the sources and the uses, right? So this is the sources is how am I going to fund this? And then the uses are obviously all the ways you're going to use your money. So at the beginning, you want to say, okay, how much equity can I put in? And then how much can my bank put in, or PIDC or some other, grant program or something like that. And I'm going to go through and help you kind of figure out how much your bank could potentially loan for a particular project. So that's something to consider. So let's go through some of the uses. We have obviously the acquisition, the purchase price is obvious to everyone, but don't forget about the closing costs. I just put in a potential percentage, but you would really want to get a quote on closing costs when you're working on a property. And then again, hard costs mean construction costs. And I just put in a couple categories, for instance, and you might split this in a variety of ways. We see some people split hard costs by trade, which is absolutely appropriate. I just wanted to kind of show some larger categories, like you might have building systems, like your HVAC, sprinklers, fire alarms. Those are really big. Your plumbing. Those are really big items that, people are big dollars, and people just kind of forget about them sometimes because they're not seen, right? They're often behind the scenes. Often, exterior building. If you have an old brick building, it might need repointed, other facade work. This could be expensive. So just wanted to make sure you were thinking about that. Interior fit out is probably the thing that everybody thinks about when they think about construction, right? You put in your walls, you put in your new floor. If you have residential tenants, you're putting in some, you're putting in cabinets, bedrooms, you might be putting in bathrooms. So that's the kind of stuff that I think is the most obvious. And then site work. This would be, do you have landscaping? Do you need a sidewalk? Do you have a driveway? Are there something else that needs to be done on the site as a whole? So those are just some high level kind of categories to help you think about them. And then I mentioned the soft costs. So we have again, you might have more soft costs, but these are just to kind of get you thinking about some of the categories. We mentioned the design and architecture, environmental reports. Something we didn't touch on yet was broker commissions. If you're going to have, if you're going to be leasing the building, you might have to pay a broker to get that lease. So that's something to consider and ask. I also mentioned taxes and utilities. This is the taxes and utilities while you're doing the construction on the project. So you might have a tax bill that comes due in March, but you don't have any tenants yet. Well, how are you going to pay that? You want to make sure that you put that in the budget for what you consider your construction budget, because that bill needs to be paid, even if you don't have tenants. And then here's that value. We might have inspections. This is actually not the inspections that you do before you purchase, but this would be the inspections that the bank does as construction is going on. And also the city of Philadelphia requires construction inspectors. So they send out third-party inspectors as well. So you want to make sure you know how much all those cost. And then you're probably going to also need insurance on the property, right? So you need something called, if you're doing construction, you might need builder's risk insurance, general liability insurance, property insurance are all things that you might need, and you need to work with a insurance company to get a quote on those. So you can see a lot of elements for you to coordinate here, and you want to get a quote for all of these. And then the transaction cost would mean the loan fees. So you have origination fees. You want to ask your lender up front, how much are those loan fees? They might need additional reports. So you want to get, I know you might want to get specifically ask how much those will cost, because I often see people leave those out. And then, at closing, they're paying an extra $20,000 that they weren't planning on. And that could be cash that they weren't planning on bringing to closing. I'm going to pause for a second. There was a question that said, can this template be shared? It was actually emailed out to all participants on Thursday. I don't know, Marla, if folks joined between now and then, if we could kind of send it out again.
We will absolutely send it out to everyone who was on the call who registered after Thursday. Yes.
Great. Okay. And then I have an interest reserve. This is similar to what I was just saying about taxes and utilities. You might have to start paying interest on your loan before you actually are in the building, right? And so that's something to consider, so that you have money set aside to pay your loan while you're doing construction or while you're getting the building leased up. And then we talked about legal. This could be either your legal or the bank's legal. So there could be lawyers at several stages here. So you just want to make sure you have all of that. And then, as we mentioned, you always want to have contingency in your budget. I put 10% in. That's what I want to see whenever someone comes to me. I want to see 10% contingency. So I put that in for you. But again, if it's early in your process, you might even want to have something larger. I will tell you, I'm not, I haven't been doing this forever, but I have been in this field now for over 10 years. And I have never, ever been on a project where someone didn't use their contingency. So just keep that in mind. Okay, let's go to the next tab, the assumptions tab. Okay, this is where you would kind of put in your, again, you could do this a lot of different ways, but this is a way you could put in how much revenue you plan to bring in to a property. So this is, based on units, and it shows how much, rent they're paying. And then you'll notice I put in an annual increase each year. That's something to consider. And if you have an annual increase, you then need to make sure that's actually in their leases, that it's going to increase that, each year. And then this is operating expenses for each year, every year, not for the construction, but now this is for your operations. So again, how much are your ongoing taxes? How much are, utilities, maintenance? You might think, like, do you need to hire a property manager to help you with this? That's something to consider. These are really different depending on, what kind of property you have. So an industrial property is really not as expensive to operate as a residential or office building, because those folks just have more needs, and there's just more to do in those spaces. And a lot of industrial tenants, they might take care of things themselves. So that's something to consider, right? Like what things are your tenants paying for, and what things are you paying for? That's something to think about at the very beginning of your conversation with your tenants. This could be a real surprise with people, right? Because a lot of people have experience with residential, you always ask, like, what utilities am I paying, right? It's kind of the same thing here, but you have to think about, utilities. What happens if something breaks in the facility? Whose responsibility is that? You would want to make sure that that's really laid out. Likewise, you would sometimes in properties, the tenant actually pays the taxes. So that's something to consider. So there's a lot of different, there's no wrong answer. You just need to make sure you talk with your tenants about that, and it's all part of the negotiation. So you will see, just kind of high level here, we have $78,000 coming in every year, and we have $18,000 of expenses. So that's pretty good, right? And that difference is where you can take out a loan, because you have additional revenue coming in that you can use to pay debt service. All right, so let's move on to the third tab, operating projections. And this is kind of where you put it all together. This is for 10 years. I've seen some people do this monthly if they're kind of leasing out a space, a residential space. But, annual is fine for your bank. This will show, again, you see that 78,000 for gross revenue. It goes up every year because of that 3% increase. And then I always like to add in a vacancy rate and collection loss, because not everybody pays their rent on time, and you might lose a tenant. So that's something to consider. And then you have what's known as your gross income. Then we have all of the operating expenses that we discussed. And in the end, on line 21, we have our net operating income, which is, again, the revenue for this property. I want to pause a little bit, because if you are a business and you're operating a property yourself, right? There's no other tenants in it. You might not do something like this. You might just be showing PIDC your normal business financial statements. But we would want to make sure that in those financial statements and your projections, you've added in the additional cost of owning a property. So again, your taxes, your utilities, the repairs. So that's something, you know, that we want to see that you have in. And then the last section right down here is the actual debt service of your loans. And the big thing to consider is, and we're going to go through kind of how you play with these numbers, is the last line, debt service coverage ratio, line 32. That's what that stands for. Your bank is going to have a very specific number here. What does this mean? It means how much can your income cover your debt service payments? So 1.08 means that my income can cover my whole debt service. It's over 1, and there's like 0.08 left over. And where does that 0.08 go to? That goes to you. That's what you come away with, right? But everything else is going, if it was just 1, that would mean all of your operating income was going to pay your loan. All right. So the bank usually wants to see 1.2. All right. They want to see a 1.2. That means you can cover the loan and then there's 0.2 left for you. All right. And that makes them kind of not as nervous. And also we want to make sure you get paid. That's an important part of this, right? Like you are someone who is a business or you're trying to generate wealth. We're not trying to take every dime from this project. So that's something you want to look at, and you'll notice that, you know, in year 3, sometimes they'll let you, you know, maybe not right off the bat, but in year, 3 or 4, you want to be able to get to 1.2. Now, PIDC is a little bit more lenient. You know, we might go lower than 1.2, but we want to, again, still make sure that you're in a good position and that you have money coming to you. So you'll notice that there's like those numbers in red. So how do you actually, how do you figure out like how much the loan costs and how do you get those numbers? And so the last tab, the debt service schedule, is where those numbers are coming from. And I'll just walk you through a little bit there. So these are amortization schedules. I use them all the time, but I think that it's helpful for you guys to use them as well. A lot of people just like do this on the internet now, but I think it's helpful to actually see it. So if you punch in all the assumptions on your senior loan, it'll tell you your annual debt service. So you see that the annual debt service on this is $34,000. You want to kind of play with those numbers. So you want to be asking around, what are interest rates? I put in 4.5%. It completely depends on the project and you and your credit experience, what kind of rate you can get. So, and then you want to ask like, what's the amortization? What's the term of the loan? When would I need to pay it off? So those things will all change. For instance, let's say that you found out that interest rates are going up to 5.5. Can you change that, Quinn, to 5.5? So that increased your annual payment by $3,000. All right. And so I bet if we go back to the operating projections tab, that debt service coverage has lowered, right? And now we're not hitting the 1.2 anymore. And so we need to then make an adjustment somewhere else, right? So what does that mean? That means either the revenue has to go up, the expenses have to go down, or we take out less debt, right? So that's what I mean by like everything has to be adjusted and played with for you to kind of get the right number. And if one thing changes, if your budget goes up, if the interest rate goes up, you might have to make changes throughout your project. So that's something to consider. Okay, and someone asked, can the Lynch interest rate change over the life of the loan? Okay, so that's an interesting point. You want to ask your lender if the loan is fixed interest or variable interest. Fixed interest means that it's what I'm showing here, which means it's the same interest rate. You lock it in on the day of closing. So and that's kind of how residential mortgages are. You typically lock in your interest rate. There are some, you could get a variable interest rate loan, but that obviously that's riskier. right? Because you might not know what your expenses are. So that could be really risky. We kind of recommend against variable interest rates. All right, I'm gonna pause. I think I've talked enough. I'm gonna allow, just wait for some questions on this. And then if there aren't questions, I want to turn it over to our clients to talk about some of their experiences with some of this. All right, Paul and Catherine, do you want to chime in, unmute, and tell us kind of what you experienced, and maybe some pros and cons and tips?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I don't know, watching the webinar, I feel like I wish that we had access to this information when we bought a property, and hopefully everyone watching can learn from our mistakes, because we didn't really know what we were doing at the time. And it took us, we still don't really know what we're doing, but it took us a really long time to figure it out. I guess I'll just give like a brief overview of our story and our experience. So we identified a commercial property that we wanted to buy, and we got a mortgage through Wells Fargo because we weren't really familiar at the time with like local banks or PIDC. And we had our home mortgage through Wells Fargo. So it just seemed like it made sense. And we kind of just like, we were in a hurry to just like get the property before we missed out and it went to a different buyer. So we kind of just guessed at the construction budget and got an SBA loan through Wells Fargo for the cost of the building plus what we thought would be the cost of construction. But it was a very rough estimate at the time. And unfortunately, the loan didn't allow for us to change the budget for construction after we closed. And we ended up in a years-long process just being stuck with this building that we weren't able to use because we couldn't afford to do the construction on it. So we were basically just paying the mortgage on a building that we couldn't use while simultaneously paying rent on our existing space. And then finally we found PIDC, and then we ended up finding another local bank called Port Richmond Savings. And with the two banks combined, we were able to refinance the loan and finally do the construction and move into the building 3 years after we actually bought it.
Thanks so much for telling us about that. And it's really common, what you guys went through, and I'm glad it ended, well, and that you're in there now. I know you worked with Heather's team and we didn't work together personally, but we're seeing that a lot today, even more, because construction in, something that's happened is that construction pricing has gone even higher, even with the same budget, the same scope of work. Construction pricing is really increasing, especially in COVID. And so we're seeing that happen to people, who thought they were doing everything right, and their construction budgets are going up and they don't, have the cash to cover that. So that's, another reason why, a good contingency could help, but it's a great point. Anything else that you guys want to add in? We appreciate your participation.
It was just, I guess, like we did a lot of the things you were mentioning before, like we went through, like we did an environmental and there was weird issues and we had to like get proof. We didn't actually have to do a phase 2, which is kind of, I guess, like a good thing, like for people to know, is that just if there's like a question on phase 1, it doesn't mean like you're going to be like stuck in this huge phase 2 process. Like it was just like a little more work to figure out like proof of some things.
Mm-hmm.
That's also something that can happen.
Mm-hmm. I was also going to add, even if you don't feel like you know what you're doing, I think just having like working with the local lenders and working with contractors, architects, realtors that are really experienced with commercial properties is key, because they can help guide you through the process.
Yeah. And did you guys, use like a project manager or what was that kind of, or what would you do differently about that part of the managing the construction?
With the construction, I guess it was like in the beginning, we were just trying to use someone we knew, and they
Mhm.
weren't necessarily familiar with commercial construction, which was kind of a big issue because we just kind of assumed that they would know what they were talking about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not like they did anything like on purpose, like to, negatively affect us, but it was like, just like inexperience is hard to work with, like it's like, I mean, our project honestly cost like, I think it was like 3 times as much as what the original estimate was.
Mhm.
And like, so I would suggest like, yeah, like definitely trying to find someone with some experience in what you're trying to do,
Yeah,
which
and
was
we ended
very
up
hard.
switching contractors
Yeah.
like 2 years into the process, shortly before we were finally ready to start.
But like, it was
construction.
like, once like we had somebody who knew what they were doing, which is like, I mean, was very hard to find, don't get me wrong, but like, once we found someone, it was like day and night. It was like, oh, like stuff's happening now. Like, it was amazing. I mean, like, we had to figure out the money part, but like, it's definitely good to try to find somebody who actually knows like experience what you're trying to do. And it's also like, I guess kind of along with that, like we had to scale our project down a lot. So like maybe that's something maybe to have like multiple plans. Like it's like, even if you're on the same budget and like you have a budget, I would be like, okay, we can do without this part of the project and we can still run our business. We can still like rent out space, we can still do whatever we want to do. Like we basically had to take out like, I guess like 1/3 of the project, right? Like we had to take off the whole roof portion of our project. And we had to like cut some other stuff out that we wanted to do. Like, I mean, like not like, I guess it was mostly aesthetic, that stuff that was like inside our actual production space and
Yeah,
stuff.
bells and whistles.
Yeah, but that's like a good thing just to have in mind is like, okay, so this is what I need to do. This is like what I like to do, and then like just try to work with it so you can get your business going.
That's a great point. I think that everybody should, that's a great thing to do. Because like what I was saying about even something little happening to your project, like if the interest rate environment goes up or the tenants can't pay as much rent or something happen, your budget goes up. A lot of people just assume, okay, well, can I get more loan? Can I bring more cash? But sometimes the answer is just cut the budget down. And sometimes that's like the last thing that people think about, but it can be not the easiest, but it's like the one that's makes everything more simple, once you just, okay, like cut that down. So, and you could always do it, you could potentially do it later or do it, little by little.
Yeah, that's true. Like if it's something like, yeah, you could just like make sure you get the building, get in the door, your business is running. Yeah, a couple of years, you could always like try it. I mean, we're in a weird situation because like, I feel like right when we're starting to get comfortable, like COVID hit. Like, so, I mean, we had to panic. I mean, not like, or like figure out a new like plan like for that to make that all work too, especially because we had tenants. We had to work with them. I mean, it all worked out, but it's like, I mean, so far, but like, yeah, that's stuff you have to be ready for.
That's great. And that's a good point because like I think this is like, this year has shown us like, you never really know like what life is going to bring. And that's why one of those reasons, like we don't want people to take out the highest loan possible because we want there to be some breathing room, right? You don't want to max somebody out so that they can't, shift and be flexible to something that happens. And that's something that we look for as lenders, that we're, for PIDC, that we're kind of giving folks room.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody have questions for Paul and Catherine? It's so great to have them on the line with us. Okay, so we have a comment that that someone's finding it hard for a company to give you hard numbers like up front when you're buying. They don't want to really put time into a bid for someone who doesn't like own the property yet. That they kind of find that it's just tough to find a contractor, tough to find bids. So when you found your contractor, maybe kind of go through, how did you find it? How did you find that person?
The contractor that we ended up working with for the bulk of the project, once we finally started moving forward, was someone who our realtor and our architect had both worked with a lot. And it feels silly that we didn't find him sooner since he was a connection from 2 different people, but for some reason it took a really long time. But yeah, he was great. His name is his company is called North Standard, and his name is Ken.
Sarah, if I can also add, in certain cases, you can hire a owner's rep that can give you ballpark numbers until the exact buyout of contract can be made. So if you're not knowing anything about development, it's always good to find an owner's representative who can represent you in negotiations with the general contractor, and to get to pull the permits and to do all the legwork for the operating company.
Yeah, that's a good point. You could, if at the end of the day, you could always hire someone. That's right. Like if it's hard for you to find someone to do it for free, you could hire someone. That's a good point. And then as Paul and Catherine mentioned, using a connection is sometimes a way, because the contractor, they might be like, oh, I don't want to put time into these people, I might never see them again, but they might put time into it because that architect continues to recommend them, right? And so that's really your pool, is that they're thinking about it as like total business development. But listen, we are also in a situation right now where there is a labor shortage in Philadelphia. We know that COVID has made it worse. And so contractors are, being kind of picky about jobs that they do, especially small projects. So it can be really hard to find people. And that is why I do recommend, having relationships and going through relationships. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I think we can continue to accept comments and questions, but I just wanted to kind of show two ending slides that I had, which are where to find other financing resources. And I just want to make sure that I show folks that. PIDC has multiple resources for what we call, commercial real estate or real estate. So pretty much anybody is eligible, and we have programs that go from 50,000 to 5 million. So a really wide range. So please bring your project to us and we can kind of see what programs it fits for. We have a commercial mortgage loan for businesses. We also have loans for real estate developers, or if you're somewhere in the gray area, we kind of do that too. The thing to note here, though, is PIDC specifically has to have a non-residential component to the project for us to be involved in the financing. So just want to make sure that that's really clear. PIDC often comes in if there is also a bank. So if you go to a bank, but they're not able to give you as much money as you need, we might be able to come in behind the bank. It's called subordinate. We take a subordinate lien. So for instance, the bank would get a first mortgage lien on the property and we would take a second mortgage lien. So that's kind of PIDC's bread and butter. We're used to doing that. We like doing it. And we've worked with pretty much every bank that is in the area. And someone asked a question about kind of the construction loan to conventional mortgage. PIDC actually is unique in that we typically come in at construction and we stay in for 5 to 10 to 20 years, depending on the program that you use. So we come right in at construction. Just as we kind of heard from our other clients, we like to see all that due diligence, all your construction due diligence up front. So we like to come in right at the time of construction start. And again, we stay in. So we don't really have a construction loan here or a permanent loan at PIDC. It's all one product. Okay, so yeah, again, I think folks hopefully on the call know PIDC a little bit and should hopefully come to us with their projects. I do want to kind of talk about some other resources outside of PIDC that I want you guys to know about. So next slide, thanks. And this is if you're doing a residential project, you might want to look up PHDC, This is right from their website. They have residential financing programs, and I'll try to send the link along. So that's something that you guys should look at. They have several funds, especially, and obviously they're focused on affordable and workforce housing. So I definitely encourage you to look at their website for those financing opportunities. And then the last resource that I want you guys to look at, that last slide, is the initiative called Jumpstart Germantown, right? This is, I don't know if folks have heard about it, but there's Jumpstart in a variety of communities. It all started with Ken Weinstein in Germantown. He's a local developer there, and he created a program to help folks get started in the real estate industry. And his website, one of his main, I guess his mission is to really make this available for everyone. And so he has these resources that you can download right from his website. So that's something I think that would be really great. So I gave you guys a template, but he has another Excel template on his website that you might want to look at, especially for his are probably better if you're going to do like residential flips. And so, and he has a bunch of, again, more webinars or presentations. And so I encourage you to look through his resources or join one of the Jumpstart programs if you're interested in doing real estate kind of full time. This webinar was more focused on businesses who are looking to do purchase and do construction for their business operations. But the Jumpstart is really great for real estate developers who are getting started. So those are some resources that I think would help everyone. And a couple more questions. So yeah, you could reach out to me and my colleague Lawrence with any questions on your project. And I think we have about 5 minutes for more questions. And I think we actually had another client on the line. So apologies. I think we had we have Eatable Delights also on the line. So if they want to add in the last few minutes about their experience purchasing property, we'd love to have you guys join in too.
Good morning.
Hi, David. Thanks.
How are you? So my experience with purchasing my property really began and ended with PIDC. I was suggested to go to another bank, but I really wasn't interested in dealing with another bank. I found the process at PIDC for me, because this was my first commercial purchase, just what I needed to be, which was I was a preschooler learning what had to be done to purchase this property. By the time that I finished going through everything, I'm probably at somewhere like a first or second grade level, and I'm okay with that. There were things that I learned along the way that I could have and should have done differently. Not upset by any stretch of the means at what I learned along the way, because it gives me valuable information for when I purchase my second property or when I come to PIDC again, some of the things that I learned along the way. One of the things that I learned along the way is to pretty much follow my inspector around like, I guess a puppy would follow behind an adult. I found along the way that there were things that my inspector did not catch. And the great thing though is I'm very blessed, because once I discovered these things, I did have the money to actually purchase them. And this was all the while, during COVID. I was the recipient of some grants and things like that. And I'm sure that's for another call. But the financing part at PIDC for me was very helpful by way of the knowledge, of the way of the questions that was asked, the things that I was learned. And I would actually go to PIDC again for another commercial property.
Thanks so much for that. I really appreciate that. I think everyone starts out at that level, by the way.
Okay.
All right, any questions for David or last questions for me? I know I want to respect everyone's time. I think, again, you can put stuff in the chat, you can put stuff in the Q&A, you can raise your hand, and Quinn can unmute you. So lots of different ways to ask questions.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, it is 10:58. We have 2 more minutes. Sarah, we want to really, really thank you for rounding out part 2 of this 2-part series. We encourage everyone to take a look at the replay. So Quinn will post today's webinar and yesterday's webinar. And before you make a final decision on purchasing a property, make sure you just educate yourself through the information that we've provided. You can always call PIDC for information, and we will try to help you as best as we can. The last thing we want to see is mistakes that could have been avoided. So take advantage of the professionals at PIDC. In addition to Sarah and Lawrence, we also have a real estate division within PIDC, and we rely heavily on that division also. So if there are questions that may not necessarily be financing or underwriting questions, but general real estate questions, we do have a division, and we can certainly make a referral there and you can get support. So we like to think of PIDC almost as one-stop shopping. On some of the larger projects, we are, as Sarah and Lawrence mentioned already, we are partnering with banks. If you are in need of finding a bank, we may be able to provide you with a few referrals. And this is all based on experience PIDC has in underwriting so many projects around the city. You would just be surprised at the number of small business projects, owner-occupied projects, mixed-use projects, shopping centers, hotels. We run the gamut from smaller to larger. The amount of financing, though, is consistent with Sarah said. So from $50,000 up to $5 million. So if there is a $50 million project, PIDC still will not go beyond that $5 million limit. So keep that in mind. All of the resources for PIDC's webinars can be found at PIDC.com PIDC blog.com / and then you can see the rest of the address. So please access that, our blog, for any of the webinars that we've had. Sarah, we will make sure that all of the participants in today's webinar get a copy of the budget template. If anyone gets it and you have any questions, feel free to give us a call. We want to make sure you understand the spreadsheet so you are actually using it. It's going to be invaluable when you are putting together your project and seeking bank financing. PIDC fills a gap. That's our role. So as a subordinate lender, you maximize the funding that you can get from the private sector, and then where a gap still exists, that's where Sarah will help fill that gap with PIDC funding resources. So if that's it, it looks like I'm seeing some chats. So thank you, everyone. I am going to put my email address in the chat. If there's something that comes up after today that you have a general question about, just shoot me an email and I'll make sure we answer that question as quickly as possible. So again, to Sarah, thank you. Let me
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sarah, for all of your excellent information. I know she's not here, but for the record, I also want to thank Dorothy Hamill, who was our presenter on yesterday for part 1. Also, the team at PIDC, Quinn, Jasmine, Stanley. Of course, we want to thank Lawrence, who partners with Sarah in the underwriting of these projects. And our most important are our PIDC clients, David, Catherine, Paul. If Mike is on, thank you so much. And then for you, our participants, we hope to see you on Tuesday. Today's Wednesday. We may see you on tomorrow evening when we're talking about technology for small businesses. We certainly do want to see you though on Tuesday with the first of our 6-month webinar series, Is It Just Me? Mental Health During the Time of COVID-19 and Civil Unrest. And so with that, have a wonderful day. We look forward to seeing you soon. So long.